Okay, so now that we've gone through demand, we've gone through supply, we can put everything together and analyze some of the examples we looked at before but didn't examine completely. So it's about time we bring supply and demand together at last. Okay, now as we kind of bring both of these pieces of a market together, right? Remember, a market is nothing more than just buyers and sellers interacting, right? So the demand curve represents buyers, the supply curve represents sellers, and these lines just tell us how each group behaves, right? Demand curve slope down for buyers because buyers want cheaper prices. Prices are lower, they'll buy more, right? The supply curve slopes up for sellers because sellers want higher prices, right? They're willing to sell more if they can sell more at a higher price, right? So it's just two groups of people. We bring them together. We're going to introduce a topic here that's pretty important in supply and demand analysis. This is this idea of equilibrium. So most of us are familiar with this term, probably from a chemistry class or some science class. And usually in those classes when we talk about equilibrium, it's when we're talking about balance or rest or a homogeneous solution, right? Typically in chemistry, if we're mixing something together, we would say the mixture is in equilibrium when it is thoroughly mixed. Or we can think about it in chemistry as something's in equilibrium when all the chemical reactions have taken place, right? So this idea of rest, no more change, balance, and it basically is the same idea here in economics. So when we use the term equilibrium, what we're getting at is, okay, we know buyers and sellers are going to interact in a market. You can kind of think of like a market where people are haggling over prices. And equilibrium is where, the haggling is done. Buyer and seller agree on both the price and the quantity. So that's kind of what we're getting at here. So as we say here on the slide, equilibrium, it's a state or it's this outcome in the market where this conflicting forces of buyers and sellers, supply and demand, are in balance. That is, we've reached a point where buyer and seller agree on the price and the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. That is, buyer and seller agree on both price and quantity, okay? So that's what we mean by equilibrium. So now let's look at the data that we've just gone through in the other videos for demand and supply, right? So we don't have the graphs drawn here, but if we look at the data here for demand and the data for supply, let's see if we can identify the equilibrium. That is the point where buyer and seller agree on price and quantity, right? Now, if we look here at a price of 2, we see, okay, the quantity demanded for buyers and the quantity supplied for sellers don't match, right? Buyers at that low price would buy 8 million cans. Sellers are only willing to sell 3 million, so they don't agree there, right? But look at the one below it. At a price of $3, buyers are willing to buy 6 million cans of Spam, and sellers are willing to make and sell 6 million cans of Spam. It's the only point up here where both buyer and seller agree, right? And again, if we go to a slightly higher price, right? If we go to $4, right? Buyer and seller aren't in agreement anymore because buyers at that higher price only want to buy 4 million cans, and sellers at that higher price would be willing to sell even more, 9 million cans, but they don't agree. The only point they agree is at a price of 3 and a quantity of 6 million for each, right? Now, those of you that have done this before know that what I'm looking at here is basically the intersection of supply and demand. The intersection of the supply and demand curve is the only point on our graph where both buyer and seller agree. That is, it's our equilibrium, right? So if we regraph both of our lines, we can see exactly this. So we've got our demand curve here, right, representing the buyers of Spam. We've got our supply curve over here, representing the sellers of Spam. The only point that they agree is right here where the two graphs cross. And notice how, given that I graph this precisely with computer, right, it occurs at a price of 3 and a quantity of 6, right? So the graph matches the data, and so that's what we're getting at when we talk about equilibrium. So when buyers and sellers interact in a market, they kind of move towards equilibrium naturally, right? And this is one of the cool things about a market, is that you don't need anyone controlling it. Buyer and seller slowly move towards equilibrium, right? Sellers want to sell, but they don't want excess supply. Buyers want to buy, but they want lower prices. And so this back and forth moves toward equilibrium, okay? So now that we've kind of put everything together, let's go back and do two example problems, and the ones we've already done, right? So let's go back and revisit the egg example. So we did this before. We were looking at demand. This took place back in the 90s, right? This is where that study came out and freaked everybody out, and everybody stopped buying eggs. So let's go through and do this analysis now that we have the complete picture, because what we're going to want to be able to do with this analysis is say, okay, there's a before, some change is going to happen, and then we can kind of look at the after picture and we can figure out what happens, right? So that's why with supply and demand, there's always a before, a after, and then tell me what happened, right? And usually what's going to happen is we're going to have a market initially in equilibrium. Some change is going to happen that's going to change the market. And then I want you to tell me what happens after that change, what change happens in the market. So those are always the 3 steps of these graphs, okay? So we know 1990s, this first study came out, said that eggs had high cholesterol, and if you ate eggs, you were going to keel over and die early of a heart attack, right? So, of course, everyone freaked out because everyone's so reasonable. Everyone freaked out, and we know from doing this example before, this is a decrease in demand. So let's walk through this, okay? All right. So let's go ahead and label our axes. Price up here and quantity down here, okay? Let's draw in a demand curve, right? And we know we're going to have a decrease in demand, but we'll get to that. So let's label this with a D1, okay? Let's go ahead and put in the supply curve. Here we go. Draw an upward sloping curve. Again, now that we're doing more examples, we don't have to be precise and graph it for price and quantity. We just need an upward sloping line, right? So this is our supply curve. Okay. Now, the first thing you're going to want to show with these graphs is what the market is like initially. All right. So way back in the 90s, the market for eggs was very happy. Okay. Now, when we're labeling these, probably the most common way to label our graphs is to use little stars. So this star here denotes equilibrium price, and this star on the quantity down here denotes equilibrium quantity, okay? So now we have the demand curve represents buyers, supply curve represents sellers, and the equilibrium, that is that point in the market where buyer and seller are naturally drawn to, is now labeled, okay? So now we've kind of shown things before, right? All right, now we know this study comes out, everyone freaks out because that's what we do when news like this comes out, and we know this is going to be a decrease in demand. So I'm going to draw this in here. This is D2, decrease in our demand curve, and I'm going to go ahead and label this up here. This is a decrease in demand, okay? Okay, well, the old demand curve, D1, that's our demand curve before. We now have demand curve D2, right? This is the way things are now. People have freaked out and they want to buy less eggs. So there's a lower demand for eggs, which means this old equilibrium price is no longer relevant, right? The new equilibrium is right here. If my pencil would work, there we go. So that is our new equilibrium quantity and price. We'll call this Q2 star. And P2 star is going to be here because D1 is no longer our demand curve. That's the old demand curve. That's the demand curve before this study came out. This is going to be P2, this is P1. So notice how we're going to get a fall in price and a fall in quantity, right? So our new equilibrium is down here, right? This is our old equilibrium, and this is our new equilibrium, okay? So that is, our graph can now tell us exactly what's going to happen in the market. There's going to be a decrease in demand. Demand curve shifts to the left. It shifts from D1 to D2. And when that happens, we're going to get a new equilibrium that has a lower price and a lower quantity, right? So those are the three things we're looking at with these graphs, right? Show me what the market is like initially. That is, draw the initial equilibrium. Show me the change, and we did. We drew in the decrease in demand, and we labeled the new equilibrium. And now we can do that third piece, which is basically say, what happens? Well, what happens is price falls and quantity falls, right? And so that's what we'll answer here. As a result of the study indicating egg yolks contain harmful cholesterol, what happened to the equilibrium price and quantity? The nice thing is, our graph just tells us, right? Price falls and quantity falls. So price decreases and quantity decreases. And this is exactly what happened to egg prices back in the 1990s, right? Quantity that people want to buy plummeted, and the price for eggs plummeted as well, right? So that's the powerful aspect of this simple supply and demand diagram, is you can use it to analyze any market, right? Stuff after a hurricane, or stock markets, or NIL stuff, anything. You can use this supply and demand diagram to tell you, and it'll tell you what's going to happen to price and quantity. So let's go back and revisit the salsa example, right? So remember, this is the one where the new salsa machine is invented, and if it's my salsa company, I promptly lay off most of the employees and use the new technology and make more salsa, right? So we know from doing this example before, this is going to be an increase in supply. And again, we know it's from some new technology, right? It's an advancement in technology. So again, let's go ahead and do the before, the after, and then figure out what's going on, or figure out the change. All right. So again, let's label everything: price, quantity. Let's draw in our demand curve. This is our demand for salsa. Put in a downward sloping line. There we go. Okay, and let's put in our supply of salsa. We'll call this S1. This is the initial supply. And then show me that initial market equilibrium, that price and quantity that buyers tend to be drawn towards when they interact together in a market, okay? All right. So now I've got everything labeled: equilibrium, price, and quantity. It's my lousy star on the price there. See if I can make that P a little more definitive. Okay. All right. Well, we know this is going to be an increase in supply. So we've done the first part. We showed the market initially. Now we know a change happens. Some new piece of technology comes along, makes it way easier to make salsa. I promptly lay off a bunch of my employees and increase my supply of salsa because this technology has made it way easier to produce salsa, right? So this is the change. I'm going to have an increase in supply. But just like the previous example, we now know that our old equilibrium here is no longer relevant, right? That is, the market is going to move to this new equilibrium, right? This is old, and this is going to be our new equilibrium. New. That is, our analysis suggests Q2 star that when new technology comes out and allows businesses to produce more stuff more cheaply, what should we see? Well, we should see a decrease in the price and an increase in the quantity. And we're kind of used to that. We're used to technology helping us make different stuff, and this is what we've seen in markets time and time again. Okay, so we've done the first part. We showed the market in equilibrium. We then drew in the change, which was an increase in supply, and now we can figure out what's going to happen in this market. Well, our new equilibrium is going to be at the intersection of our new supply curve and the old demand curve. This results in a lower price but a higher quantity. So as a result of the invention of the Salsa Extraordinary 9000, what happens? Well, our equilibrium, whoa, that's too much of a zoom. Equilibrium price, what is going on with my iPad? May I approacheth the iPad? Okay, equilibrium price is going to decrease, right? This is what our diagram tells us. But the quantity is going to increase. Okay? And so there we go. We've now put everything together. We've gone through two examples where we can use supply and demand to analyze any market, and we can figure out what's going to happen to price and quantity in a market as a result of some type of change in the market.